backhand flick shot act likely is going to be a bad frisbee toss. In this video, I'm going to break down frame by frame exactly how the backhand flick shot actually works by looking at what the original flick wizard J.W. Johnson does, the man who made this shot popular and pickable today. No analogies, just pure hardcore analysis and simple explanation for what it is. If you want to learn the backhand flick the hard way, watch the whole video. I guarantee that you'll discover things that you may not have seen elsewhere before. Now before I dive in, there's a couple of things that I need to explain first, so that the rest of the video will make more sense to you. Firstly, since this shot involves a lot of wrist movement, let's quickly look at the different types of wrist movements that we have, because later on, I'll be referring to these terms throughout my video. If you forget these terms, bookmark the timestamp now, so you can always go back and watch it again. At a high level, there are 6 movements that our wrist can do. This is radial deviation. This is ulnar deviation. This is pronation. This is supination. This is flexion. And finally, we have extension. Again, if you ever get confused later on, rewind the video so you can refresh yourself on these terms. The second thing I want to clarify is that there are a few types of quote-unquote backhand flick shots. Depending on the situation, different techniques should be used. So let's quickly go through the different types of backhand flick shots that I currently see in pickleball. This is a backhand flick shot, but this is almost the last resort reactionary shot where your opponent pops up the ball high and soft. You don't have time to do the two-handed backhand, or perhaps the height of the ball is out of the reach of your two-handed backhand. For this shot, you're mostly relying on a flexion and extension of your wrist to generate the pace of your paddle swing. This is also a backhand flick shot, but this shot to me is just an extension of the backhand roll volley, except you're adding in some wrist movement when you're contacting the ball to generate more pace. Now, because the contact point is quite high, using the wrist movement to generate more pace is actually quite easy, because in this scenario, you have a lot more margin to clear the net, making it a low risk and high reward shot. Now for this shot, it really depends on the paddle grip you use at the kitchen, and the wrist movement involved might be different from person to person. For example, for me, by default I use the Eastern grip even when I'm at the kitchen. However, I do switch over to the Continental grip for certain shots when I have time to switch the grip. So for Eastern grip or Continental grip, this shot actually involves 5 types of wrist movements: flexion, supination, ulnar deviation, then followed by extension and radial deviation. And you can see why a lot of coaches are hesitant to teach this shot with wrist movement, because it's really complex and hard to control. However, with enough practice, I believe most people can actually develop a good backhand roll with wrist flick. This again is also a backhand flick shot, also known as the backhand punch volley. This is a relatively simple shot to execute. You can use this shot to speed up the ball or attack the ball when the ball is at around net height or a little bit above or below the net. This shot mostly relies on the flexion and extension of the wrist. But depending on the direction you want to head the ball, you would also need to use supination or pronation to control the direction. One thing to know here about this shot is that the power of this shot is actually generated by a combination of elbow extension and wrist extension. So you want to make sure that your elbow is not fully straightened or locked when executing this shot. This way, you always have some room for elbow extension to give you the power that you need. The trajectory of this shot is going to be linear because you're not generating any spins yourself. You're just punching the ball forward. For this reason, you don't want to hit this ball too hard. If you do, it will likely go out. Use this as a setup shot to cause a pop-up for your next attack. Now, in competitive environment, you can also go full blast with this shot to try and body bag your opponent, but I do not recommend that strategy in the rig games. Now, this shot is the shot that I really want to dive in for this video. When someone says backhand flick, this is the shot that I'm thinking about, not the previous 3 shots that I mentioned. This is the shot that if you try to learn it as if you were tossing a frisbee, you will likely mess up the shot. This shot to me is a variation or extension of the backhand punch volley. In fact, for this shot, most of the power actually comes from the elbow extension rather than the wrist itself. This is why I believe it's the closest to backhand punch volley than any other shot in pickleball. If you don't believe me, let's take a look at how the flick wizard J.W. Johnson executes this shot to perfection. But before that, I want to give a close attention to the moments leading up to the contact point and then the moments after the contact point. Let me first play this shot out in normal speed, then I'll slow it down and take you through the things that I see. Great shot, very snappy, crisp, and it's definitely a flick. So satisfying even watching it. Now let's watch this again at quarter of the speed. Let me pause it right here. Watch his wrist right before the paddle makes contact with the ball. There's some flexion, ulnar deviation, and some pronation to his wrist. As a result, his paddle head is dipping down towards the ground. So there's a lot of things going on here already. If you have a flexible wrist, meaning a wrist that's capable of large degree of flexion, it's going to help a lot to make the paddle head dip down more easily. However, if you don't have a flexible wrist, it's definitely not the end of the world, because you can still use your shoulder, arm, and elbow to compensate to achieve the desired paddle angle. However, it may reduce your reach slightly. The other important thing to mention here is that you want to have a loose grip on your paddle, because when your wrist is in this position already, your forearm is already very tense. If you then try to have a tight grip on your paddle, which also uses the forearm, then you would be overexerting your forearm, not only making this shot more stiff, less snappy, but also you'll tire yourself out very quickly. In worst case, it could even cause unwanted injuries. For me, when I execute this shot, my grip strength is about 3 or 4 out of 10, similar to how tight my grip is for my dinks. As J.W. Johnson makes contact with the ball, he starts off with a bent elbow, then, as he hits the ball, his elbow extends itself like a punch volley. This is where most of the power actually comes from, this short and explosive extension of the elbow. Also, throughout the swing, watch how his wrist stays very rigid. It's locked in its maximum flexion position in order to set up a good paddle face angle. There's no wrist extension involved in this shot, so definitely keep a firm wrist. Lastly, he supinates his wrist as he makes contact with the ball. This allows the paddle to create a slight brushing motion to get a little bit more topspin on the ball. However, most of the topspin is generated naturally by the ball rolling off the open paddle face. Since J.W. Johnson was attacking this ball slightly above the net, he can hit this ball with more pace, with a flatter trajectory and still keeping the ball in. And that's why he was punching the ball forward a lot more with his elbow extension. The paddle face should be slightly opened at the point of contact, else the ball will go into the net. In general, the lower the contact point, the more open the paddle face needs to be. Now, after the ball already leaves the paddle, you then see the wrist continues to supinate for some time before he eventually stops. This is because the supination of his wrist at the point of contact was very explosive, and the momentum of the wrist just requires a bit more time to stop. Now, in this next shot, there's a couple of things that makes this second shot different and more difficult to execute. Firstly, this ball is quite low. You can see here that the point of contact is actually a few inches below the net. To attack a low ball like this, you cannot hit it very hard because the ball needs to go upwards in order to clear the net. If you hit it too hard, it'll be an out ball. Unless, of course, you're intentionally trying to body bag your opponent, but that's a different shot. Assuming the goal here is to keep the ball in, if you watch J.W. Johnson carefully, in order to control his power, he minimizes his elbow extension during this shot. In fact, I think he may have even kept his elbow straight during this shot with no elbow extension, which helps to reduce the power. So for this shot, most of the power comes from the slight movement of his shoulder and wrist movement. More precisely, supination combined with a subtle extension of the wrist. If you pay attention to the paddle movement around the point of contact, you'll see that the paddle is mostly moving up the way, lifting up the ball with topspin. There's very little forward momentum, which is probably what he wanted for this scenario. A well-controlled finesse shot. And as he finishes the shot, he was then able to quickly snap back the wrist and reset the paddle position. At this point, I hope you agree that when it comes to backhand flick shots, there really is no one-size-fits-all. The technique may be different depending on each shot, so it's important that you go out there and experiment hitting this shot at different angles and different heights. Develop a feel for the amount of elbow extension and wrist movement needed to deal with each situation. Now, one important advice that I have for those who would like to learn this shot, and that is, do not over practice this shot. This shot puts a lot of strain on your wrist. Most people simply don't have strong enough wrist to handle too many repetitions in a short period of time. So definitely start off easy with your drills. Perhaps also consider doing exercises to strengthen your wrist when you're not drilling on a court. If you found this video helpful, I would really appreciate you do me a small favor by liking and sharing this video. Consider subscribing to my channel for more contents like this in the future. This is super duper pickable. Thank you for your attention.